who did he seek refuge of? Lord Narayan. Yep. The seeker of wealth. Who's the example for the seeker of... Dhruva Maharaj. He wanted a planet greater than his grandfather, basically, right? Wasn't it? Or father? Grandfather. Lord Brahma. Yeah, and what planet is greater than Lord Brahma's planet? What is it? He got the pole star, but what's greater? If Brahma's is the planet, or Loka is the whole of the universe, what's greater than that? Vaikuntha. Yeah, the spiritual world. You know. So, but Dhruva is still counted amongst one materially motivated because he wanted to be more powerful than Lord Brahma. And then who's the other? The inquisitive. Who's the inquisitive? Who's the inquisitive? The example of the inquisitive. Huh? The sages of Namasharanya. Yes. And then who's the example of the jnani? Or those who know that Krishna is the Supreme. Sukadeva Goswami. No. He's read his nectar. He's read the Nectar of Devotion. I'm teaching the Nectar of Devotion at the moment, so that's Chatus Kumar. Yeah, the 4 Kumaras. They already were situated on a Brahman platform, practically speaking, right? So there are devotees who they're sakam, they have desires, they have material desires. But of course the Bhagavatam says, you know, what is it? Akarma, savakarma, moksha-karma, udaradi. You know, it doesn't matter actually. We may have material desires. Most of us do have material desires. But if we focus bhakti tivrena, if we focus on bhakti yoga, we become purified, right? So, Daksha is an attached devotee, but his sons, due to the performance of their austerities, were ripe for bhakti and to be detached from material motivations. They were purified. And Narada Muni knew that. He's a compassionate devotee. And of course this is an art, actually, being able to work out who's who and at what point we should encourage someone towards renunciation and at what point should we encourage somebody towards their natural propensity as a householder, effectively. Right? So we identify who's a single person and who can be encouraged in that direction and who's, generally speaking, a householder and can be encouraged. And most people fall into which category? Which one do you think? In our experience, householders. Yes, householders. And we glorify the householders. Right? The sacrifice of a householder is equal to, if not more important than that of a sannyasi. Right? Is that right? At least we should encourage them in that way. No, because it's not easy. You know, when you think about it, working hard, and the service of a householder is looking after their business, looking after their family, you know, educating their children, feeding their children, right? Important. So Narada Muni is able to recognize, and you know, Narada Muni is his main concern, as is any devotee's concern, is for the welfare of others. He's always thinking about the benefit of others, and he's encouraging the Haryashvas and the Savalashvas because he can recognise their qualification. But of course that really upsets poor their father, Daksha. You know, I remember when I've told this story many times, but when I rang up my mum and I told her that I was living in the temple, and she said, "Oh no, Andy, you sound like a parrot already." Right? I said, "Mum, I haven't said anything yet." But she was worried. She was worried. What's happened? My son's been brainwashed by the Hare Krishnas. Right? What's going to happen? So and it's ignorance. My mum said later, 10 years later, she said, "I was embarrassed that my son became a Hare Krishna. But then I was embarrassed because I didn't know why I was embarrassed." Right? So it's basically ignorance. She was ignorant. And then, of course, when Mum and Dad found out about what I was actually doing, they came to the temple and they saw everything, and then they started to, okay, this is serious. It's not as crazy as perhaps they thought it might have been, or people thought it was. But there's that, because of that ignorance then, and we can see that ignorance in Daksha, and we see that ignorance here. You know, there were, in the 70s, there were parents paying deprogrammers to kidnap their children and take them away from the temple. Is that right? Ask the old timers about the stories. And it was, you know, it was when I joined the temple, a couple of weeks after I joined, there had been this conflict between the deprogrammers and the devotees, and I went to the Brahmachari ashram was up here, and Korma's room was over here somewhere, and we used to sleep down this end. The Sankirtan party. No, well, I wasn't part of the Sankirtan party then, but anyway, I was in the ashram somewhere, and I came back from the bathroom at 3:45, and then all of a sudden heard this loud and came upstairs, and they'd fired a shotgun through the window of Korma's room, and also fired a shotgun through the window of Prabhupada's room. And at that point I was thinking, gee, I thought the Hare Krishnas were peace and love. And what have I got myself into? But that's the kind of, enmity can be created, as Prabhupada says, and we have to be tolerant and merciful at the same time, right? Prabhupada mentions that here. Although it's interesting, prior to that, Prabhupada said, we are creating enmity in the West, but also in India. Right? Interesting. And Prabhupada was not only was Prabhupada being criticised for making brahmanas, he was being criticised by his godbrothers for some of the initiatives that he embraced or recognised were necessary to expand Krishna consciousness. Right? Setting 16 rounds as a standard was somewhat controversial. Initiating Westerners who weren't born in Brahmin families as brahmanas was controversial, even amongst his godbrothers. Allowing women to live in ashrams was... some of Prabhupada's godbrothers felt that he was corrupting Vaishnavism. And he was being criticised. Prabhupada was being criticised not only by the Brahmanas but also by his godbrothers, which he felt that acutely. Prabhupada felt those criticisms acutely because he felt they were unfair. He was preaching, right? Prabhupada was immensely proud of Mukunda then Mukunda, Shyam Sundara, Guru Das, Malati, Jamuna and Janaki. Prabhupada was immensely proud of those devotees. The relationship that Srila Prabhupada had with Jamuna, as an example, was exceptional. Prabhupada, she looked up to Srila Prabhupada as if he was her father, practically speaking. And he looked upon her as if she was his daughter. And, if you haven't, I strongly recommend read the biography of Jamuna, because in there you get to see how Prabhupada's affection and appreciation and protection, love and affection and protection of his female disciples is exceptional. And, there's a story where Prabhupada was walking, he'd go for his morning walk on the Twittenhurst estate, and a bit of gravel would get in his gumboots, right? And so he would stop, and Jamuna would kneel down and take his shoe off, and Prabhupada would then lean on her, right? He would lean on Jamuna. And Guru Das was taking pictures, right? And very affectionate exchange, because Jamuna says, she made a comment along the lines of, I think the gravel wants to be close to your lotus feet. Prabhupada said, I see it differently. But he told Guru Das, don't publish these pictures. Don't publish these pictures. If my god brothers see them, they won't understand. Because ordinarily a sannyasi just shouldn't have anything, Lord Chaitanya as an example, his feminine disciples would pay obeisances from a distance. So, in preaching, automatically there'll be misunderstanding. People will misunderstand the motivations of a devotee, the purposes, and even the practices sometimes. Right? And so that creates this friction, whereby a devotee will be unnecessarily criticised. Right? And that's what's, Daksha's really, it's ironical because, and of course it illustrates the danger of material facility, of even being a devotee, because Daksha saw Lord Vishnu. Right? He's not an ordinary person. By the performance of his rituals, it mentions in the Bhagavatam, austerities and rituals, he got to see Lord Narayan, and he was given the blessings to perform this service. But still, he became a little proud. And because of that pride, then he became a little critical of Narada Muni, because he's attached too. He wanted to see his sons, and that this is the influence of the false ego, ahankara, that makes you feel like you're the doer, right? Which affects all of us. And as a consequence, because his service was being impacted, then he was highly critical of Narada Muni. But of course, we appreciate Narada Muni as the epitome of our sampradaya, if you like. As a preacher, we know him as a preacher. Narada Muni Bhajaya Vina Radhika Ramana Namine. That was mentioned in the verse that I gave class on a week or so ago. But also, interestingly, and I mentioned this the other day, but it's worth repeating again, Narada Muni I was listening to the and this comes later in this canto. Narada Muni in the Narayan Kavacha is prayed to protect us from offences committed in worshipping the deity. Right? So, and our process of devotional service is hearing and chanting and preaching, but it also is closely assimilated with deity worship. And of course, Narada Muni also, there's the Narada Pancharatra, which gives us guidelines on how to worship the deities as well. And of course, critical for our success as devotees is there's the Bhagavat Vidhi, but there's also the Pancharatra Vidhi, so the preaching, hearing and chanting Hare Krishna. There's our japa, and chanting Hare Krishna, our sankirtan, and our study of the Shastra, and also our teaching and distributing. Right? There's that side, and that's that's considered the most important, but still there's deity worship as well. Even though Prabhupada says book distribution is more important than establishing temples. Prabhupada makes this point. Still, if we look at Prabhupada's life, what did he spend? He spent a good part of his life translating and printing and encouraging the distribution of books. Yes, he did that. But what did he do in the rest of the time? What did he do? Temples, yeah, for which we're greatly fortunate to have a nice temple. Although when Prabhupada, Shamananda tells the story, how when Prabhupada came into the temple room and paid his obeisances and then stood up, he said, it's not big enough. And the devotees at the time couldn't, whoop, this is huge. Of course now, we know Prabhupada's vision was much broader than what he was doing in the 70s even. He could see that, he knew. So Prabhupada put a lot of emphasis into deity worship. And he wanted high standards. But it's interesting, I was talking to Śrīmad Bhāgavatam the other day, we were talking about this point, and he said, well, Prabhupada was also very pragmatic. And, when he installed Radha Gopinath is a good example, because you'd have to say that most of the devotees that he initiated and gave Brahman initiation to weren't. What do you think? How qualified were they as Brahmanas? They didn't even know what a Brahman thread was. Right? But Prabhupada initiated them. And they were so sincere, so dedicated to serving Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada's instructions, and the deity worship, and also distribute books and go on Harinam. They were dedicated to Prabhupada's instructions, and so came up to the platform, came up to that standard. But the deity worship supports the preaching. It is preaching. Right? So it's interesting. Narada Muni is, he's a preacher, but he's also prayed to protect from offences committed in doing our deity worship, interestingly enough. There's a lot of other characters, a lot of other very elevated personalities who are prayed to in that, the Narayan Kavacha prayers. But that's the only one I remembered. That struck me as being interesting. That Narada Muni is known as a preacher, yet we pray to him to protect us from offences committed in our deity seva. So, And I have heard, I have experienced this. One lady a couple of weeks ago wrote to me and was complaining about the behaviour of some of our ISKCON devotees and how they were blaspheming her and criticising her because she was a divorcee. And I think they were saying, this is not what Hare Krishnas, this is not what we Hare Krishnas do. And she was complaining to me, why are these people being so hard on me? Why don't you do something about it? And I had to tell her, look, I don't know what every Hare Krishna in Melbourne's doing or saying. Neither can I be responsible for what they do. But, she was, again, this notion that, you Hare Krishnas are creating enmity in families. And we get this criticism from time to time. But I was able to placate her. I said, look, I'm sure this isn't our philosophy. We try to encourage everybody, even if they're divorcees or whatever. Whatever their situation is, we encourage everybody to chant Hare Krishna. And, I'm sorry to hear that you're having this conflict, but actually, what I told her, I said, is there some way we can make friends? Some way we can get together? She said, no, not now, I'm too hurt. I said, let's just let it sit. Let's just let it sit and let's revisit it later and see if we can't. You create an opportunity where you can tell your friends who you're feeling hurt by right now that how much they hurt you. Right? We can't do it now, we'll do it later. And she said, all right, okay, yeah, that's good advice. Because she was saying, I'm going to go to court and do this defamation and blah, 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 blah. And I said, whoa, hang on a second. You'll spend more money than you'll get. Even if you're right, even if you can prove it. Defamation's famously, complicated. And so, yep. And even in our preaching, this is why we keep the door closed. If you want to know why we keep the door closed. So there's always somebody opening up the door and then me coming along and say, close the door. Because I have to deal with a couple of neighbours over here. And we like to hear the sound of kirtan. But for some reason, they don't like to hear the sound of kirtan at 7 o'clock in the morning. Right? Neighbours on this side, they don't mind. Right? In fact, they've said to me, I came home at 4:30 the other day. I don't know why they were coming home at 4:30 in the morning, but anyway, I came home and I heard the sound of the kirtan. Oh boy, it was so nice. Right? So that neighbours on this side are okay. And most of them on this side also, but there's a couple on this side who don't like to hear the sound of the kirtan. So my father used to say, anything for a quiet life, especially with their neighbours. Although the funny thing is that the council and even the politicians say, who do they think they are? They've only just come here. You've been here for 40 years. Just forget about them. But, still doesn't hurt to be friendly with your neighbours. You never know when they're going to lob a brick on your roof. That's a tradition. If you want to harass your neighbours, that's a traditional Aussie way of doing it. Throw a brick on their roof. You're all right. You're fine. Have breakfast.
Just was going to mention a little history when you were purchasing this place.
Yes.
There's actually another part of the same Catholic ownership over on the front corner on the...
Oh, yes.
And it was probably about 4 times the size, maybe 5 or 6 times the size.
Much bigger, yeah.
And it was like touch and go, which one were we going to get? But we just, at that time, just couldn't conceive of paying off the amount of money that they wanted for that place. And so we got this instead.
And this was $180,000. Must have been close to $1 million. And it was not easy for the devotees to pay off the 180,000 for this place. We could have bought those 3 houses. They were also the 3 houses next to us here. And I think they were $10,000 each, and the devotees decided not to buy them. Oops. Okay, does anybody have any comments or questions? I've got to go. I've got a wedding to perform. Comments? Question? No. Okay. Grantaraj Śrīmad Bhāgavatam ki jai, Śrīla Prabhupada ki jai, Gaura Bhakta Vrinda ki jai, Hare Krishna.